my father is now finishing up his last days of treatment and rehab, and I went to the facility where he is staying to visit him for Father's Day. A few days ago, he had already been in Jamestown for several months. It is next door to North Dakota State Hospital, and somehow we got to talking about the paranormal and his experience there. A brief history of the hospital is this. It opened in 1885 and became an institution for the mentally ill and insane. Over the next few years, overcrowding became a serious problem, and the hospital had to be expanded several times, with severe staff shortages. In 1937, the governor fired the head of the institution, and 75% of the staff then rehired them because of their political donations. Thereafter, the new staff was not qualified to care for the patients and treated them poorly, swearing and abusing them and possibly killing some. By 1949, there was news in the newspapers about overcrowding, neglect, malnutrition, isolation, etc. And by 1953, reforms began, and things began to improve. By 1974, the population had dropped from 2,000 in the 1940s to about 600 and about 200 today. And yes, the place is still open. Today, the hospital serves as a place for mental health services, transitional housing, and chemical dependency treatment. So my father liked to be busy there, and he always took a job or helped my father in any way he could. From what I understand, the hospital was kind of like a partner in this rehab center, but the people there were more like prisoners, whereas he could live there and have a lot more freedom. He went to the grounds of the hospital, which today functions as a prison, and helped one of the women working there with the laundry. They folded a ton of sheets and towels and went down the stairs, and when they came back, the sheets were strewn across the floor and all in disarray. Keep in mind that everything is locked up in there, so there couldn't have been anyone there to do that. The woman told my father that it was Charlie, the ghost that haunts that part of the prison. Apparently, he does things like that all the time. The woman told my father that the ghosts in the prison have different names because there are so many of them. They even have some rooms that they had to close down because every time a resident or inmate moved in, they refused to come back because a lot of horrible things happened and they ended up having to just move them into another room. Even the old warden's office was so haunted that he told them that if they couldn't find him a new place for his stuff, he would quit and move. My father said that apparently things were moving around, flying off shelves and stuff like that. Since he was often able to leave and work outside the hospital while he was there, he and a few guys got local jobs pulling weeds or cleaning lawns on the hospital grounds and in the cemetery. He worked with a small crew of guys in the middle of the day. The part of the hospital we were working in was no longer in operation, but the building next to us had lots of windows so you could see all the way inside. He and one other guy saw someone walking around in there and informed his supervisor that someone was working in there too. But his supervisor said that no one had been working there for years and no one could get in. They joked that they had seen a ghost and learned that paranormal phenomena are very common here. My dad isn't lying, but he and the other guys saw him so clearly that they could make out his clothes and everything. They even asked each other, "Did you see what he was wearing?" And one of the guys who worked with my dad said in a very scared voice, "Yes, and someone is playing with us." It was a man, but they kept working even when they were scared. But then, they saw him again. Dad said the same ghost walked down the hallway very quickly toward them, while they could still see out the window, and darted around the corner into the garage. He was wearing an old black and white suit and hat, and he kept his head down, like he wanted to hide his face from them or something. The guy and my father rushed out running and said they finished the job because they were really scared. But my dad yelled at him to run ahead so they could catch whoever was trying to scare them. They went around to every possible door, but there was no one there. Somehow the boss got the keys so they could explore that part. And Dad said it was so dusty they saw footprints, and the only footprints there were their own. There were no footprints of the person they saw. My father, who as I recall was not a serious man, told me that he was genuinely convinced that the place was haunted. But the way my father described the event, always gave me goosebumps. Dad said the guy must have been doing something sad because he just avoided us and hid his face. I know it sounds weird, but I think he was playing with us. My grandparents were very old-fashioned, so when I stayed with them as a child, they kept me on a strict schedule. Even when I cried, they kept me locked up in my room in their attic. My parents were on a trip, so I stayed with my grandparents, and of course I started crying and stayed there. No one came to get me, which made me cry even harder. Then a young woman in a sunflower dress put her hand on me and started humming. I quickly fell asleep. Of course, these memories could have been anything since I was about 2 or 3 years old, but I think they are worth mentioning given the following. I had an imaginary friend named Lee. He was an old man who loved to dance but was sad because his wife had left him. Late at night, he would come to my room and dance to what kind of music? Mostly jazz. Sometimes he would tell me stories about his favorite cafe and other weird life stories. My father thought I was a quirky 7-year-old, but my mother called a priest to consecrate the house, and I never saw Lee again. Things were quiet for a while, nothing strange happening. My mom canceled a few vacations here and there because of dreams where one of us died during the trip, and it was annoying, but she saw amazing things and predicted future events in advance, so we just listened to her. My family is also very into rodeo. My father is a rancher, and my mother is a horsewoman, and so on. I was with my younger brother, who was 5 at the time, and I was about 10, and we were sitting in the bleachers watching my mom compete. My brother and I were tickling each other or something, and I accidentally pushed him off the bleachers. The fall wasn't very hard, but for a 5-year-old, falling 70 feet was not too pleasant. I was freaking out, and then a woman comes up to me, smiles, and holds out a Dr. Pepper to me. She said I had caught him, and he was just sleeping. That freaked me out, but of course my brother was fine. He just had a cold after the fall. And I have no idea where the woman went after that, so I don't know what the hell it was, but it was awesome. The bathroom on the first floor of my house had this mirror in it. It made me feel uncomfortable, so I avoided going in there all the time. But on the days I was there, I would look the other way and just try to get out of there as fast as possible. But one day I was staring at it, trying to conquer my fear, and I saw an elderly woman looking at me. I stood like that for hours, unable to move. Eventually, my mom found me and brought me out of my trance. It's a strange memory, but it's the reason I don't like mirrors today. My family also bought a piece of land in the Gila National Forest from a practicing witch. On the other hand, we found a stash of Coca-Cola, so yeah, that was fun. But she was making sacrifices and doing weird rituals on the property even before we moved there. There was a lot going on there too, starting with my dog digging up animal bones. And then they all started hearing voices coming from behind the dark trees at night. We were rebuilding little huts in a shack she had built around the property when things started to pick up. I was alone in the van we were staying in because of the remodeling when there was a knock on the door. I opened it and found nothing. Looking around, I saw something dark with red eyes behind one of the trees. Perhaps it was my imagination, but I could swear I heard it tell me we came from the mines. Naturally, I was scared, so I just locked myself in the camper and called my parents. One more note. The place is now rented out, and a strange hermit claimed to have seen the same thing behind the trees, not knowing my stories or the previous tenants. He moved in, and apparently the monk refused to set foot on the property because of the bad energy emanating from it. Also, during the renovation, we wanted to donate a bunch of tiles we salvaged from the floor in the witches' huts, but the Catholic nun refused to accept them because of their energy. I know this is all very strange, but I'm telling you all this because yes, all of this happened to me. But what the monster said stayed in my memory. The part about getting out of the mines? I did explore a lot of dead ends in this forest, but nothing beats finding an empty field. Imagine for a second that you're wandering through a dense forest and you stumble upon something the size of a soccer field with nothing but a boulder in the center of it. Apparently, this was a town that had an abandoned mine, and on the other side of the field was the Cleveland mine, abandoned in the 1800s. This small piece of land is a hidden gem of New Mexico. Old stone towers, ladders that lead nowhere, and an old dam holding back the water. But the most amazing thing was the holes. There were holes and caves that went into the darkness, and all I could think about was that whatever monster I saw had to have come from here. We heard various strange sounds coming from these openings, but I never fully explored them because of the danger of the caves collapsing, and soon we were far away. After that, things went quiet again until I started going to a private Christian school at the old Baptist church. The school had a huge basement, more like a labyrinth, and my friends and I used to mess around in there a lot. And then some really weird things started happening after a girl tried to get her best friend to do some kind of ritual down there. The 5th grade preschoolers heard a woman singing about painful things. Early in the morning, the Spanish teacher heard all the doors opening and closing, even though she was the only one there. I threw a ball down a long hallway and something threw it back. The pastor came and blessed the place, and the police came several times to look for squatting homeless people, and it was pretty amazing. Things have been quiet lately, but my mom still sees dark figures moving around our house apparently at night, but she thinks they're friendly or something. Anyway, these are all my stories, and honestly, I don't understand anything about them, but I just wanted to share some of my stories with you. In 1990, my parents took me and my 4-year-old brother on vacation to the French Alps, where they rented a small cottage for a week. I was only 2 years old at the time, so this is all based on my parents' memories, so bear with me. Almost immediately after we settled into the cottage, my mom sensed something was wrong. She was very anxious and nervous, and the feeling only grew stronger every day. At first, the parents tried to convince themselves that it all seemed to them. But then, strange things began to happen. Red spots appeared and disappeared randomly all over the cottage. The second day, my dad took a bite of an apple, and there was a red liquid in the core of the apple. The bright red liquid was dripping from the apple. He spit the apple out, but never found a logical explanation for it. They also heard knocks and creaks at random times of the day and night. Not so surprising in an old cottage, but still it gave everyone the creeps. As time went on, my mother got worse and worse. According to her, being in the cottage made her feel physically ill. She had always been very intuitive, and her intuition told her to just get out of there. Something didn't want us there. However, on the 4th night, my parents woke up with a jolt and simultaneously felt an intense, indescribable, and unexplainable fear. My brother and I must have been crying and screaming in the next room. Mom asked Dad to leave. They packed up and we left. But Mom said that when we got out and walked down the hallway, there were red stains on the walls and floor, and when we got to the door, everyone was running. When Dad turned to close the door, he said the red spots were gone again. My parents have run into each other before. Our house is very old. It was even used as a makeshift hospital during World War I. My mom always surprises me because she is usually so calm when she talks about these things. When I was still living in our house, I would sometimes hear footsteps in the yard in the middle of the night when all the doors were closed. When I was still living in our house, I would sometimes hear footsteps in the middle of the night when all the doors in the house were closed. When I asked my mom if she was out for a midnight walk, she calmly told me that it must be one of the ghosts she had seen before. I know that sounds crazy, but I promise it's not. Anyway, the only time it really gets serious is when I think back to our vacation in the Alps. To this day, her voice shakes when she talks about it, and I can honestly see the fear in her eyes. So back to the story. My parents contacted the man who was renting them the cottage and informed him that they were leaving earlier than they had planned. They were so shocked by the whole thing that they couldn't help but ask if anything had happened at the cottage before. And to their surprise, the man told them about it. He said that my parents were definitely not the first to report strange occurrences. After more questioning, he finally told me that there had been a murder-suicide at this cottage in the early 88s. A man killed his wife and children and then hanged himself in the attic. Let's start with the fact that I'm a 17-year-old girl from Colorado. I'm white, and I don't have a drop of Indian blood in me, but I don't think that matters much. My father's family has farms in Minnesota, built on land that was densely settled by Native Americans over a century ago. We know this because we've honestly found boxes of Native American artifacts, including tons of arrowheads and spearheads, ceremonial jewelry and pottery shards, chipping stones, and more. And each year, during spring planting, tractor drivers contribute even more. There have been paranormal occurrences on our land, but I'm there very often, so I've only experienced a small handful of things that I can't quite explain. For the most part, even though I am a Christian and believe in the paranormal and supernatural, I enjoy trying to find logical explanations for things. I can often be very curious, and it takes a lot to scare me. I've been through enough crap to lose most of my fear, but this year has been a challenge for me on every level. For example, I had to move back to Minnesota, where I truly consider home, on the Wednesday after Memorial Day, because my grandfather died the morning of Memorial Day. His death, quite frankly, shook all of us. He was stubborn and strong, and despite his shortcomings and infirmities, he always persevered when he was sick and decided to return to the farm. But apparently, he just couldn't take it anymore and passed away peacefully at home, surrounded by his wife and children. He wanted all his grandchildren, including me, to attend his funeral, so I flew down as soon as I could, leaving my life responsibilities in Colorado. My mom was kind enough to come with me, even though my parents divorced when I was little, and she just lived in a hotel and never went anywhere, even though we invited her to the wake and funeral and stuff. My mom just wanted me to connect with my Minnesota family like never before. So the night I flew in, my aunt offered to drive me to Uncle A. My Uncle A lives a quarter-mile down the road or across the field from my grandmother's farm. In fact, my grandmother's farm is visible from Uncle A.'s house, and I could easily walk to and from the house. When I arrived, my uncle almost immediately gave me a .22 caliber rifle and a Mountain Dew soda and complained about the dairy. He said he would give me the reins, and I agreed to go shooting. It was getting dark, and the scope on the rifle was off, so there was nothing but leaves in the sky. If the scope on the rifle had been good, I would have made $5 that night, at least. My uncle found another .22 caliber rifle with a good scope, but by then it was too dark to tell the difference between Thrushes and Robinsons, and it's illegal to shoot Robinsons in Minnesota. Yes, to pass the time, my uncle built a pyramid out of old soda and beer cans and set several gallon glasses on a gallon of laundry detergent for us to shoot at. My younger cousins soon showed up with their bows and rifles too, and my uncle and I took turns showing the boys how to fire the guns, as well as shooting our .22s. We had a great time, and I almost forgot the main reason I was in Minnesota. My cousins had gone down to the basement where my aunt and uncle's wife were sitting, and in the meantime my uncle and I were still firing our .22s when my uncle suddenly ordered me to stop shooting. He was tracing something with his finger. Uncle said breathlessly, "What the hell is that?" And I, alarmed, asked, "What is it?" I squinted to see what Uncle was watching, and then I saw it. From our vantage point, we could see many young fields over the hills. If you looked to the left, you could see grannies, and if you looked to the right, you could see a few more farms scattered across the fields. If you looked straight ahead, you could see the slope of a large hill with a field, and in front of that hill was a small grove of trees that also surrounded our area. The creature my uncle pointed out was walking parallel to the horizon, and eventually ran across the hillside, which was no more than a quarter of a mile away from us. As it did so, it dragged its butt, running as fast or even faster than a racehorse. The creature was solid black, very large and slender, with a small head, extremely long and thin legs, and no visible tail. At first we thought it was a deer, but it was too slender and black to be a deer. Then I suggested that it might be a dog or perhaps a horse. But no one in our area has a black Great Dane or a big black dog at all, nor does anyone have a black horse, and the way this creature ran was unlike either of those two breeds. It was the size of a horse, but it ran like a deer, with a spring in its step. It had a slouching back, legs long and thin as twigs, and its head was quite small. In fact, it resembled a greyhound, only much larger, and it also looked a bit skewed and warped. I don't know how best to explain it, but I just knew it was truly amazing. I could see that his front was bigger than his back, like his rib cage was bulging out a bit, and while his front legs were almost like long human arms, his back legs were like a deer's, only a little more fleshy, and his hips seemed to stick out a bit like an old Holstein cow. He was jumping and gaining speed like he was hunting, but we couldn't see that he was hunting. I wasn't nervous until he swerved in our direction and crashed into the thin line of trees that separated our lot from the neighbors. The line was no more than 2 trees thick, and they were oaks no older than 20 years. We definitely should have seen the thing stop, especially since it was no more than 300 feet away from us when it hit the trees. But we didn't see or hear anything. Besides, even when it came nearer, nothing definite could be said of it except its size. He was slender, long-legged, with a small head and no visible tail. My uncle's wife suddenly turned her attention to us, asked what the hell we were seeing, and said we were scaring my little cousins. My uncle described it the same way I did, and I confirmed it because she thought we were talking nonsense. My uncle and I stayed where we were, with our rifles loaded and ready, and we watched those trees for about 10 minutes, glancing at each other from time to time, but we saw nothing and heard nothing moving. The night was windless and quiet, so we could hear just about everything, including the cows almost a mile away. It probably goes without saying, but we were both very scared, and I spent some time on my phone that night researching various things to find a rational explanation for what we saw, but I found nothing but stories and descriptions of skinwalkers, which frankly matched the creature we saw perfectly. I had heard of skinheads before and plenty of stories, but I never believed they existed. Or if they did exist, I thought they only inhabited the southwestern states, but I suppose they could show up anywhere. So what do you think? I'm open to possible explanations, similar experiences, and other ideas. I don't usually tell paranormal stories, but what happened that Wednesday night will definitely stick with me. When I first left home after graduation, I moved half a state away from my home state. I worked 2 jobs and studied, and ended up renting a room from a woman. At first, she seemed very normal, but after a few weeks, she decided to tell me that she was a witch, that she and her coven ran around naked in the mountains every full moon. I didn't particularly care because everyone has their hobbies, right? I eventually left though because she stole from me, caused conflict, killed my pet fish, and did horrible things like wake up several times in the night to find her standing in the doorway just staring at me. Anyway, I left, and she started demanding more money from me. I paid rent every week until I moved out, but she wanted another week for the week it took her to find a new roommate. I told her no and not to contact me, but the woman harassed and tormented me for weeks until I called the police. Later in the new place, I would periodically wake up at night and see something standing in the corner of my room. It would appear and then disappear, so I assumed it was a dream and went back to sleep. Over the next few weeks, I would wake up and find the object moving closer and closer to my bed each time I saw it. However, this would pass, and I would go back to sleep. At this time, I started getting unexplained scratches all over my body except my face. At first, I thought the scratches came from bumps at work or at home. However, as time went on, the scratches got bigger and bigger, even in places on my back that I couldn't reach, and on my neck. Meanwhile, what appeared in my room at night began to take on a female form. People tried to tell me it was sleep paralysis, but I was able to move and talk quietly. One night, however, I woke up because I couldn't breathe, and I thought I had arms wrapped around my neck, and I woke up to her standing over me and smiling. As soon as I opened my eyes, it went away, and for a week or so I had no problems. I usually sleep in the dark, but light from the main parts of the house came through the hole under the door and also through the side slits, allowing me to see objects in my room. And the last time I saw the thing was when I rolled over on my side one night. Air hit me in the face, but I didn't pay attention to it, and then I felt another blow to my face. I opened my eyes and found myself face to face with this thing that I can only describe as looking like a rotten woman. She looked like a woman had died and been in a pond for days or something. Her hair was disheveled, her face puffy, Her eyes closed from swelling, but she seemed to be looking at me. Her chin was resting on the bed, and the rest of her body was bent under the bed. After staring at that abomination for a few seconds, I quickly sat up and it just disappeared. But after that, I was too scared to get out of bed and had to wait until morning to do anything about it. That was the last time I saw it, and I don't have any more scratches on my body, but I wonder if it has something to do with that witch I pissed off. I'm a 20-year-old university student from Australia, and this happened last winter, 2017. I moved a few hours away from my hometown to go to university and wanted to earn some money while I was studying. I had been a high school tutor in high school. I really enjoyed tutoring and thought it would be a good way to further my studies, so I started looking for students to tutor. I was soon contacted by a mom who asked for tutoring for her son. I'm not quite sure of his age, as she only told me his year, and I don't remember if I asked how old he was, but I think he was about 9 or 10. We arranged to have tutoring sessions with the tutor, even though he is at their house, and agreed to meet that week. On the appointed day, I showed up at their house for the first session. It was a normal first meeting. The mother was nice, and her son was very cooperative, although a bit quiet. When you're a tutor, all you need is a student who will try hard and listen to your instructions, and this student was very well behaved. Their house was small, shack-like, but very neat. We studied at the kitchen table and in the dining room, which formed an L shape with the living room. The entrance to the house was in the corner formed by the 2 rooms. Behind the dining room and the entrance was the student room. The door was locked, but I knew from the decorative sign on the door that it was his room. If the door was open, he could see directly into the living room. So the first few weeks of tutoring went well. I was very excited to work with this student and his mother, but after a few weeks I began to notice that the student just didn't seem like me. He seemed very tired and didn't respond well to my instructions. It wasn't that he was obedient, it was just that he couldn't focus properly or anything like that. At first I brushed it off because it was winter, cold and nearing the end of the second semester, which in Australian schools usually lasts a long time. This is when students start to get sick and run down, so it's not unusual for my students to look a little tired at this time of year. So we had a 2-week break for the school vacation, and I was hoping that after that he would be well rested and ready to start again. However, during our first class after the vacation, he looked even more tired. I struggled to get him to follow any instructions, and it took much longer than expected. In fact, it was so bad that I interrupted the class for a moment and asked if he was okay. Was he feeling fine, or was he having trouble with his schoolwork? I didn't want to argue too much with his mother in the room, but I knew I wasn't going to get anywhere by just moving forward when he clearly wasn't. By this point, it was probably the saddest story you'll ever hear. That was until the student replied, "I can't sleep." Before I could say anything, he went on and told me that a woman in a white dress crawls out of the clock in the dark. I can see her from my room, and I am afraid to sleep because I know if I close my eyes, she will grab me. He points to the old clock in the living room, which is angled so that it can be seen from the student's bedroom. And now I'm thinking, okay, this is terrible. Crawling, not walking, specifically crawling out of the clock. I asked him as calmly as possible, "Have you watched any scary movies or read any scary stories lately? I think this kid has seen or read something horrible and then had a nightmare, or he just has an active imagination," but he just shook his head. At the end of the session, I told his mom about it because I was concerned about how upset he was, and her response really shocked me. She said that yes, I had heard strange noises coming from the living room. This clock came into our house very recently, and it's very old. Someone inherited it, and then when they died, their kids sold it and I bought it, and that's all I know. I keep an eye on everything he looks at, and he doesn't look for anything wrong. I don't know where this fear comes from or what to do about it, but honestly, it scares me a little too. At this point, I don't know what to think. I put that question to the back of my mind until the next time I see him. Nothing more is said about the woman, and the student seems to have finally gotten some sleep, so all is well as far as I'm concerned. But about 5 weeks later, I find myself back at their house and the weather is getting downright nasty. Gusty winds and heavy rain with lightning. The storm started a little earlier this year, but it's pretty bad. About 40 minutes into the session, the power goes out, and the only source of light is a flash of lightning that you can see through the living room window. Mom comes out to check on us, but there is nothing to do at this point. We wait for a few minutes, but the electricity doesn't come back on. Mom offers to stop and pay me the full amount, since we're almost done anyway. As I'm packing up to leave, a huge bolt of lightning flashes, and I hear Mom sigh. I look up, and I swear to you, I see the hem of a white lace dress flopping down on the floor in front of Grandpa's clock and fading into the shadows. That evening, I wasted no time getting to my car. The whole event chills me to the bone, because I never believed in ghosts before, but now I'm not so sure. And the scariest part, if what I saw was real, then maybe this boy really does see a woman crawling out of his watch. When I was younger, I often went to visit my grandmother in Mexico, in Durango, in the municipality of Canitland. We went there just because of her, and it was a beautiful little house that stood on a hill and looked like a long mountain going into the forest. I have stories about it too, but I digress. The front door led into the main room, which connected to another smaller room in the back on the left. This room had 2 doors. One was into the main room, and the other was on the right wall leading into the kitchen. The kitchen was not very large. It stretched from the door. It was only 7 or 8 feet wide. At the end of the kitchen was a door leading to the street. Behind the house, the yard was fenced and faced the river at an oblique angle. There was tall grass everywhere, and the whole thing stretched for 200 feet, maybe a little more. All of this is important, or at least relevant to the story to come. So my grandmother was the sweetest cook and hugger, and loved to tell me stories about all the strange things she saw, and stories passed down from my ancestors. My mom's family is Native American, and I was 9 years old when she told me a story about a demon that walked the river behind the house and swam the entire length of it every few years. Of course, being a kid, I took it as a crazy story to entertain myself. And that's what she told me. Apparently, the demon is not looking for anyone or seeking to kill anyone by, say, looking at the river from afar. But sometimes it comes to houses and stays in an empty room, wishing only not to be disturbed. As soon as she said this, her demeanor changed completely. She put her hand on my shoulder, met my gaze, and said the following in Spanish. "You have one chance. You have one chance. If you ever walk into an empty room in the dark, and it is unusually black, or you see the silhouette of a black and red creature, just walk out of the room and close the door. Do not open the door until the next morning. If you disturb the demon or return to it, it will not hesitate to kill you or drag you into the river." When she said this, her voice was filled with a sense of fear and importance. 3 years later, I went back to my grandmother's house again, still as happy, still cooking. I was there for a month because it was summer, and my mom wanted to take care of my grandmother because she knew she was dying and wouldn't live a year or 2 at the most. And about 2 weeks later, it happened. It was an ordinary day, actually a beautiful day. There was lots of green this time of year, and then night came. Grandma and Mom slept in the main room, and my brother, cousin, and I slept in the other room, all 3 of us sleeping on top of each other because the couch was big enough. I woke up for some reason that I still can't explain, and saw that the surroundings were much darker than I was used to because there were no real streetlights, just the moon. All in all, there was no reason to panic. I was just a little out of place. Focusing my gaze, I began to study the door. It wasn't a regular door like the one that led to the main room. It was an old wooden door with holes and cracks, and I thought I heard some movement in the kitchen. It wasn't exactly usual for a streetcar or other animal to sneak in and move something to eat or whatever, so curiosity took over and I decided to take a look. I kept as quiet as possible, but not because I was scared, not because I felt scared or anything, but rather because any noise was much louder. There were no cars or city noises, just silence, and I didn't want to wake people up. I got down on all fours, peered into the small opening, looked around, but there was nothing. It just seemed empty. Turning around, I heard it. Soft, almost peaceful breathing. I looked again, but this time I decided to look longer to let my eyes adjust. As I looked around the room, everything seemed normal, but then my gaze darted to the left corner, almost like a rabbit seeing a coyote, and my stomach dropped hard. I saw something lurking in the corner. My mind told me to yell for help, but my instincts told me not to move. That was until I heard a noise, almost like chopping wood. Then another, and when I realized what it was, the real terror began. I saw it moving, and in an instant found myself with my back against the door as the crackling continued. When it stopped, a soft red light began to seep through the gaps in the door. The breathing became louder, but the tempo remained the same, and when I heard it, my gaze flickered to my brother and cousin, who, to my surprise, were lying on the floor with their eyes wide open. I heard some wooden vessel that was hanging stirred and glowed. At that moment, I heard the door leading outside creak slightly, and the light went out. I heard it moving slowly through the grass down to the river, and a few minutes later we heard dogs barking in the distance, as if they had been bitten or something. And that night, I fell asleep right there by the door. The next morning, my grandmother woke us up to make breakfast and saw that my face was completely pale. When I explained what had happened, she said I had done a good thing and to never forget the mercy that thing may or may not have shown us that night. I know some people may not believe this, but I swear to you that this happened to me, and I have many more stories like this about things my grandmother warned me about that I ended up seeing or hearing in the neighborhood. But what was even scarier was that more often than not I saw or heard something she described without me telling her beforehand. But this time it was the opposite. My crazy and mentally ill uncle also lived in this house. He was always telling stories about what he saw and no one believed him. But after this incident, I wondered if he actually saw some things. Oddly enough, everyone I talked to was from this area and had lived here for a long time, and they all said they had seen something too. All of this gives me confidence that what I saw that night was real, and not just something I dreamed up. The mountain in front of the house has always beckoned, and I must tell you about it, but first here are some interesting facts. I was talking to my mom today and started discussing the land my family owns. It turns out that although the land is now divided amongst family members, there are hundreds and hundreds of them. However, one of those lands was a large tract of mountain. Yes, there was a mountain in my family. This immediately raised a number of questions that, while I would have liked to have answers, I didn't have enough time to answer. But in her overly long and unintelligible way, she said it wasn't based on hearsay. When she was young, she had worked in the fields that were in the mountains. So I stopped her there and asked her questions about the features of the mountain to see if I was telling the truth or just blabbing extra. First, here's what I confirmed. Toward home, the mountain was steep and dry, but when you got to the top of it, it sloped down at an angle. The slope was covered with shrubs, small trees, and sand covering a lot of yellow and red rocks. However, when the ground became as flat as a plain, it turned into the semblance of a forest. The trees didn't stand too close together, but they were large, with thick thickets of grass and shrubs. After walking through this large area, it came back to a sharp corner overlooking another small town. I clarified what kind of wildlife lived there, just to make sure that what I was about to talk about wasn't something she had ever seen or knew existed in the area. I just wanted to know exactly what to rule out. It was deer, coyotes, wolves, wild dogs, and so on. I asked her afterward if my grandmother had taken her story seriously, and she confirmed that she had, including about her own experiences. One of them was being tied to chains that dragged her for several nights in a row through the mud, and as a result, she never went home alone again. Well, in this case, it was just me, and I wish it hadn't happened. My grandmother had always encouraged the adventurous side in me, so I decided to climb the mountain. I had to. My mom reluctantly let me go, only giving me at least basic sustenance and taking my grandmother's old but very strong dog. This dog was not like ordinary dogs either. He was fiercely protective of his territory and was basically a border collie crossed with something that gave him serious canine strength. He was a good guard dog until, as far as I know, he died of natural causes when I was away for a while. He was only good at guarding, not at all good for other dog stuff, and his name was Pippi. Pippi and I started our adventure early in the morning. Until the sun rose above the horizon, we slowly made our way up into the mountains. My goal was to explore the slope and do some reconnaissance before heading into the woods. Pippi took great pleasure in watching the perimeter around me, occasionally destroying flowers. I searched the rocks for anything of interest, but as I was going over a flat yellow rock, I noticed something. There was dead silence. There was no wind, no animals. Everything was still, and when I looked around to see where Pippi was, I heard a loud click in the direction of the woods. But I only blinked and walked on. Nothing out of the ordinary, right? The dog wagged his tail happily in anticipation of our next move, and I started moving through the woods. But something was wrong. Not terrible, just abnormal. The light wasn't penetrating the forest. I know that a dense canopy can create the illusion of darkness even on the brightest day, but there was a decent amount of space between those trees. I concluded that the angle of the sun's rays combined with the elevated temperature made the air thick with moisture and caused this illusion. So I headed onward. My journey was not long, or so it seemed. However, the farther I went, the closer the dog's eyes looked at me, questioning my decision to go on. I resigned myself to this, as the dog was more concerned about our distance from home than anything else, but he started doing it again, but now in the woods. He started with glossy eyes and got to the point where he started shaking his head in the direction of the woods, back and forth. He kept doing this until he finally stopped and took his eyes away from the woods. And now I realized that something was wrong. I assumed that this must be the end of my journey, since the predator had probably been following me the whole time. I asked him to turn around, and we headed back the way we came. However, every few minutes he would head toward the woods, keeping me on my toes. This focus on a potential predator disappeared when we reached where we were before. As my thoughts began to calm down, I felt a nice breeze. How nice to finally cool off, I thought. But that feeling was shattered by the realization that in all the time I had been here, I hadn't heard a single noise other than the sound of my dog, myself, and the mysterious clicking of the wind. I cast one last glance at the forest to appreciate its beauty, but knew better. I turned my attention to the direction of the wind. Sudden gusts and squalls of wind are not uncommon here. However, this was no ordinary wind. After walking through different neighborhoods and from different directions, I noticed that the wind was blowing in one direction, into the forest. Now I was more intrigued than anything else, and was convinced that the most likely explanation was a dry, hot pressure system over the mountains that was driving cold air toward the center, which is exactly where the forest is. I asked Pippi if he saw anything else, and he responded by wagging his tail and sticking out his tongue. Of course, why not trust a dog's judgment? After all, so far he had been right. We both came to the edge of the forest. It was still dark, but I could already make out where the tree seemed to open up again. My only goal at the moment was to cross that dark part and face my unrealistic fears. I was no idiot, and if there was anything waiting for me, that dog would pounce on me. After all, he killed coyotes for fun, and my uncle had also taught me as a kid how to fight dogs, big wild cats, and more. I easily fought off dogs and killed a coyote and a wolf in self-defense. Not that I've ever hurt a dog for no reason, but anyway, you get the point. So with my makeup on, I went into the woods and there was nothing there. No fear and no painful sensations. The bushes annoyed me a bit, but I made my way out of the darkness and, feeling proud and strong, surveyed what I called the mock forest. I turned back the way I had come from and saw Peebee at the edge of the forest. He didn't come with me, and somehow I didn't notice it. Still happy, I smiled at him, but as I looked closer, a thought occurred to me. The sun must be at least 10 in the morning. There was no reflection in my eyes, no light, no forest. As soon as that thought crossed my mind, I saw his body language change, and in an instant he pouted and bared his teeth. My stomach churned, and before I could think anything else, I ran like a man clinging to the last thread of life. But as I ran, I could have sworn I saw the darkness following my every step. It seemed to grow darker and darker around me, and just as I felt it coming, I felt a hard rock on my shoe. In one motion, I turned around, ready to either live or die, scared to death and about to pee my pants. But there was nothing but the woods and a light breeze. The dog whined softly, and I stepped back, keeping my eyes on the forest and keeping the dog in sight. I turned to look over the edge of the mountain, down toward the house, and saw my mom looking at me nervously through her binoculars. I waved my hand in relief and walked back down. Clearly shaken, I asked my mom that I needed to talk to my grandmother. Mom thought it was because I saw a wolf or just some crazy natural phenomenon. I explained everything to my grandmother, but strangely enough, she didn't answer honestly right away. She sadly explained that she didn't have an answer, and the person who might have one was my great-grandmother, who died not too long ago and lived to be almost 100 years old. But here, our faces lowered, and she slowly put her arms around me. I still have questions, and I'm going to get answers about that forest, but my recent conversation with my family led to more stories, and one of them we all heard was about the cursed or blood gold that I was a part of when my grandfather was killed. But that's another story, another time. Needless to say, I don't have any answers yet, but damn, there's something in these woods. I'm 27 years old, and at the time this happened, I was a high school senior who was always freaking out and partying away at parties. I won't reveal her identity in this story, but let's call her Kay. Kay almost cost me my life, and honestly, I never want to see her again. First, a little bit of history about Kay. She grew up in a privileged society. She was given everything she wanted. Her parents adopted 5 cousins, and that's when she started to rebel. Her rich parents began to pay less attention to her, and Kay was given all the freedom in the world that she wanted. At the time of this incident, Kay was 18 years old, and I just turned 18 as well. We went to hang out at a guy's house. Nothing more than a little weed we didn't expect. I've smoked pot and swallowed pills many times before. I tried ecstasy last summer, but I planned to stay sober. She picked me up and we stopped to buy cigarettes at a gas station. I bought a drink at the fountain, with the store and everything, and it's crucial to the plot going forward. We get to the apartment and everyone is smoking, including Kay, but I refuse. She always said she didn't want to smoke alone, complaining that I never got as high as she did, so I listened and cleaned the bong from her high. Notice without even getting completely stoned. She asked for a drink of my soda, so I held it out to her. She drank it too within a minute. I turned my head, talking to someone on the side of the road. When I looked back at Kay, she was fiddling with my straw. I didn't pay any attention to it, and she handed my glass back to me. And about 30 minutes later, I started shaking violently and decided to run away from the group. I went outside in front of the house to smoke, but found I couldn't even stand up, so I lay down on the porch, and then all these dark thoughts went through my head. I felt so sick, like my stomach was being ripped open. I couldn't get up. I had to crawl to the bushes to get out, and I thought, all this to clean a bong? So I lay down on the porch again. The apartment was on a busy street in the city I live in, and I considered getting stuck in traffic because I felt like I was dying. So I had 2 options. I could stand in traffic, get hit by a car, and stop this horrible pain I was feeling. Or I could call for help, maybe flag someone down. Obviously, my mind was not in the right state of mind, and I knew that no one from the backup would take me seriously, and I knew something was really wrong. I thought about calling my mom. I must have dialed her number 5 times and hung up. Finally, I called her and told her what happened, and that I didn't know why I was in this position. No one else felt the way I did. It seemed like it took forever before Kay came outside looking for me. As I pulled my guts out into the bushes, she asked if I wanted to go get something to eat. I asked if she was serious, and she laughed when I felt sick to my stomach. I didn't realize that. My mom called my older brother to come get me because he lived near me. He showed up with a machete, ran into the house, and started threatening people because he didn't know who gave me what. It wasn't until I got home that my brother looked at my eyes and noticed how dilated my pupils were, and they took me to the ER after vomiting, of course. My memory is a little hazy, but I remember asking my sister-in-law if I was going to die and telling her I was scared. I ended up being sedated for yelling and threatening the nurses, which is totally out of character for me. They did a toxicology test and found MDMA, the drug in ecstasy, as well as other drugs in my system. I believe that other drugs were used to make ecstasy. It's all scary and everything. However, what I learned a few days later shook me to my core. The next night, Kay was at a house party and someone in attendance told me that she'd been giving free ecstasy to 4 different people. Of those 4 people, 3 of them started having seizures and had to be taken to the emergency room. My guess is that the ecstasy she used was a very bad batch. And remember when she asked to drink my soda? I think that's when she threw the pill in and it dissolved. Maybe she crushed it beforehand or something. I have no idea. But at that point in my life, I had been off drugs, especially ecstasy, for a long time. Kay also kept telling people that I was the one who slipped her the drug, and she should have been hospitalized too. She's a pathological liar, and she was actually forced to go to therapy for a long time for mental health issues and such. All of this happened because she just wanted me to get high like she did. It's crazy to think that I could have ended my life that night because I was just not myself. It still affects me to this day, and I know it sounds corny, but I have a hard time trusting people with those experiences, among other things. Obviously, I also don't like drinking with friends, and am afraid to go to a bar or club for fear of the worst. If my own friend did that to me, what's to stop a complete stranger? So I always defend my drink no matter what. My fiancé and I work at Walmart. We live in a small town in Colorado, and now because of all this fire crap, Phase 2 of the ban is in place. This means you can't even smoke a cigarette outside without being fined $1,000. It should also be noted that since we live in such a small town, the police and fire department have no choice but to patrol the parking lots for smoking in public places. Anyway, we both smoke cigarettes, and both of our cars have different issues right now, so we share one car. So far, we can only smoke in our cars on breaks, and since he was working and I wasn't, I drove over to his place on my break so we could spend a few minutes and smoke together. I pulled up to Walmart and thinking it would only take a minute, I turned on my hazard lights and waited. A couple minutes later, a car drives by me but slows down and without saying anything, rolls down the window. The guy in the car didn't stop, didn't scream or even look at me for a long time before parking, but something still freaked me out a little bit. I called my fiancé and told him to try to move a little, mentioning the guy surprised me. I realized the headlights were on, but after all, people do that near Walmart all day long, and who breaks down in front of Walmart anyway? I'm still on the phone with my fiancé, who I see approaching my car from the other driveway. I notice the guy get out of his car and walk into Walmart through my rear view, but instead of continuing on his way, he immediately pulls up to the side door where I parked, steps out of it, and I see that he is holding something that looks like a baseball bat. At this point, I freak out because this guy starts walking towards my car at the same time as my fiancé. The creepy guy hits the right corner of my hood. I'm standing there with a sword that I can now see is 3 feet long and has a scabbard on it, looking past my car like he's looking for someone or pretending to look for someone. This guy also has a huge set of knives attached to his belt on his belt. I only managed to catch a glimpse of his face without trying to be seen, but I could definitely tell that this guy is on drugs or something. It's hard to tell exactly what, but from his eyes and paranoid actions, I'd guess methamphetamine. My fiancé had finally made it to the passenger door when Mattman turned to face him, and I was about ready to hit the klaxon or something to distract him, but Mattman surprisingly doesn't do anything, but just spontaneously walks by, and my fiancé gets safely into the car. The guy keeps walking. I pull away and park further back in the parking lot, and my fiancé and I talk a little bit about how scared we both were, not knowing what the hell this guy was doing. And a little bit of scary stuff, too. My car was giving me trouble on the way there, so I often drove it with my fiancé during his break, just confirming that the problem was getting worse. My fiancé only had a 15-minute break, so I had him call our police department to report it, asking them to come and check it out since he had another 2 hours, and I stumbled when Metman saw our faces. I was alone and was afraid he might follow my fiancé to Walmart with his sword and try to do something. Or secondly, follow me home. After all, he had seen my car, the license plate, and we both drove around town a lot during the test drive. When the cops arrived and tracked down my fiancé in the aisle he was holding, they got a description and immediately realized who he was. Turns out they also knew exactly where he lived. In a trailer park across the street from Walmart, and they had been watching him because of previous incidents with the security guard at our kiosk. Apparently this incident happened that way as well. The guard stopped him for some reason, and the guy came back a few days later and asked the guard, "What else are you doing in my town?" To which the guard replied, "What do you mean? I'm living here." And the guy told him, "Not for long." Like, what the hell? I think it's also important to note that we live in a small town, a tourist town, and the local population is mostly rich older people, so it's a good place to retire, but very expensive. I mean, you see people strapping rifles to their jeeps, but not methinks with swords. Anyway, I think they found him in the parking lot and warned him that if he was ever seen in Walmart again, let alone with a knife larger than 10 inches, he would be arrested. I haven't seen him since, and frankly, I'm glad I did. Guns are certainly scary, but in our town a lot of people keep them on their belt, so it's not as scary. The eerily druggy look of a man with a two-handed sword in his hand is something else, though. So my partner and I decided to spend the 4th of July at the Rich People's Mall in the center of our town. It has real restaurants, a great movie theater, and an easy commute home. But when we get there and eat, the place is packed. By the time the movie starts, everyone is already cleaning up in time for the fireworks. We watch the movie, and maybe there were 5 other people in the theater with us. By the time we leave, and my partner leaves the restroom in the movie theater, it's already empty because it's only 9 o'clock on the 4th of July. In other words, everyone is watching the fireworks. We get about 10 feet away from the movie theater, and suddenly I need to go to the bathroom too. But we're already out of the movie theater, so they won't let us in. All the stores close early because of the holiday, so the place is deserted, and the only way out is to use the restroom at the mall. Not the worst thing in the world, but it was just inconvenient. The first thing my partner and I notice when we walk into the restroom is a bunch of security guards literally running around like they don't know what to do, just freaking out. I knew it was a red flag. A big flag, actually, but now I really need to go to the bathroom. And I think if it's something incredibly bad, they're going to tell us to leave, right? They're not going to let me knowingly go in there and use the restroom knowing the danger, right? So we walk into the Sea Loser, and we hear banging and screaming coming from one of the bathrooms. The bathrooms are right next to each other and share a wall, so I have to walk past the guards in this bathroom to get to my bathroom, which is in the thick of this wall. My partner and I think it's just a junkie going crazy in the bathroom, and the security guards at the Rich Mall have never dealt with this kind of thing and don't know what to do. We think so because they see us walking, see me walk past them, and say absolutely nothing. Then again, I think to myself, if it was serious, they would talk, right? I walk into the restroom, and as luck would have it, all the stalls are running out of toilet paper. So I have to spend extra time checking each stall for toilet paper, walk over to it, grab a towel, go back to the stall, then wash my hands and leave. As I walk out, I see all but one of the guards literally running away. The remaining guard looks 1,000 yards away from me, still rambling through the bathroom. My partner had no idea what was going on, so we just took the elevator to the main floor and went outside to call the elevator. We get outside and there are police cars everywhere, flashing their lights, standing in front of the door. The cops jump out and the security guards flock to them. A large policewoman with the look of a superior, looks at one of the guards walking toward us and says, "We got a report of a homemade weapon." The guard replies that yes, in the upstairs restroom, and they startle. Then the door closed behind them and we heard nothing more. They didn't stop moving from the moment they opened the police car door until they were inside, so it was clear that this was a really serious matter. My partner and I looked at each other and tried to wave it off. It's probably no big deal. It's probably just some junkie who got his hands on some lighters or a cherry bomb. We call the elevator and a few minutes later they appear. There's a little more traffic at this intersection, so we're stuck in the mall for a minute since we're right at a stoplight. The elevator driver asks why the police are needed, and we explain what happened. We see the door open and the cops push a hooded guy in front of us who is struggling to hold an improvised explosive device. Let me tell you, it wasn't a cherry bomb. I mean, it was the size of a shopping bag and contained 18 to 24 huge tubes. Maybe a firework? There were wires, duct tape, and everything looked like it was connected to either a big center wire or a giant center fuse. In other words, I think it might have been a bomb. And then the light switched and we just drove off. I have no idea how he got into that bathroom. I mean, he barely made it. I don't know if he was interrupted by delirium or if he was pissed because he tried to do it and failed. I also don't know why they didn't call someone other than the regular police to deal with it. I think they were busy as it is a holiday involving pyrotechnics. My partner and I were scared, to say the least, and the loud banging we heard for the next 6 hours from our neighbors didn't help. I looked around, but nothing about it appeared in the news, crime publications, or anything else, which makes me wonder if this case has been moved to another thread because it involves explosives in a public place, or if it's such a common occurrence on the 4th of July that it just wasn't deemed noteworthy. Either way, I don't know what he was doing in the restroom with all those explosives, but I'm glad it didn't go off when I was throwing out the trash. The neighborhood I live in is far from limitless, and I have to say that our neighbors are great. Well, all except for one dude. This guy who lived next door to us was just a total jerk, also a convicted sex offender, and his latest arrest made me remember the first time we met. This guy was constantly making his big dogs bark outside, and one day my mom went next door to confront him. Unlike me, my mom is pretty aggressive and confrontational, and while I try to avoid conflict whenever possible, she just goes for it. But I want to say that I care a lot about my family, and I can tell if a person is good or bad just by reading their body language. This ability has never failed me yet, so I trust it. So when my mom went to talk to him about his dogs, he didn't answer the door, but a couple nights later I was home alone with my younger brother while my mom was at work. The security system alerted my phone to a visitor. Since the man I saw in the picture was unfamiliar to me, I ignored him, and nothing happened. The next night the guy came again, and this time my mom opened the door. I was sitting nearby upstairs listening to the whole conversation from the living room couch. The man was being a total jerk to my mom, saying that if she worked hard or didn't work at all, she wouldn't come home and hear dogs barking, and she just needs to get a life and stop being lazy. Right now, my mom, I can vouch for her, works very, very hard. To me, she's a single parent, a girl with cystic fibrosis, and she's also a real estate agent who was managing about 80 houses at the time. And how dare he say that, right? At this point, I got really pissed off and climbed to the top of the stairs to look at this guy who called my, but not lazy mother that. It was the same fat guy I had seen on camera the night before. He didn't see me, but he saw my little brother come out of the basement to see what was going on. At the sight of my 7-year-old brother, the guy's tone changed dramatically. He suddenly became awkwardly kind. My mom got tired of the guy's horrible singing voice and just closed the door in his face, and the man finally left. A week went by. We didn't hear anything about the dogs, and the same guy who called my mom lazy last week came to our house with a plate of fresh chocolate chip cookies and apologized for his act one too many times. Then he and all in all disappeared from our lives.